Our gospel passage today starts with Jesus going off by himself. Or at least, Jesus tries to go off by himself. He's just learned from his disciples that his cousin, John the Baptizer, forerunner to Jesus' mission, has been killed by an agent and actor of the empire. Jesus seeks to go into a deserted place, a wilderness, a desert, and yet even there, the crowds follow him. Even in the midst of his grief, Jesus doesn't give up and heals their sick. Evening comes and the people are hungry. The disciples, practical, if not as compassionate as Jesus, want to send the crowds away. As we pivot from John's death and start preparing for Jesus' death in Matthew's story, Jesus starts getting the disciples ready for their own ministry. When they want to send the people away, Jesus says to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." This week has been a lot. The economy shrunk by roughly a third when looking at the annual numbers from just last quarter. Republicans in Congress can't decide how to help people as the COVID-19 pandemic shows no signs of slowing. Rent freezes are ending and eviction proceedings are getting started again. With no work, no opportunities for work, no money coming in, people are about to be even more homeless and even more hungry. This doesn't take into account how reopened schools or enhanced reopened public places or the resumption of college sports may continue contributing to death from COVID-19. With over 150,000 Americans dead from this disease, those who survive experience long-lasting physical impacts. This is happening as access to health care, whether tied to employment or not, dries up, and hospitals reach capacity. All this bad news stirs my grief. Even in the midst of his grief, Jesus doesn't give up. He has compassion on the crowds and heals their sick. When evening comes, the crowds are hungry, and the disciples would send them away. Jesus tells the disciples to give the crowds something to eat. The disciples have 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus takes, blesses, breaks, and gives the food. The disciples pass it out, and there's more than enough. Regardless of how this miracle happens, 5,000 men, as Matthew puts it, so around 20,000 people overall, are fed. There's more than enough, but not much more. Everyone eats and is filled. This isn't scraps of a meal. And by a slim margin, there are leftovers. Only 12 baskets after feeding 20,000 people really isn't a lot left over. Yet everyone had enough. In God's reign, everyone has enough, and God hears the prayer, "Give us today our daily bread." From the midst of his grief, Jesus makes sure that the crowds, whose cheers will soon enough turn to jeers, have enough. In his compassion, Jesus directs his true followers to care for those around him. Sending them away is practical. Feeding them is God's reign made manifest. Anna Case Winters writes, Jesus manifests a freedom from self-protection that exposes our bondage. Rather, Jesus manifests a freedom from self-concern that exposes our bondage to self-protection and the many forms of servitude to which self-regard holds us captive. Jesus' compassion unmasks our selfishness. It is becoming clear to the disciples in this chapter, and hopefully clear to readers of this gospel, that it is not possible to follow Jesus and our own self-interest at the same time. Even in the midst of his grief, Jesus doesn't give up. He has compassion on the crowds and heals their sick. He wants to be alone, but lets the crowds follow him and doesn't care only for himself. When we see Jesus' acts of generosity, our own hoarding and self-concern are thrown into sharp relief. While the disciples want to send the crowds away, Jesus tells us, to give them something to eat. I've seen the feeding of the multitudes happen before COVID times when crowds could amass along the banks of the Seine. Groups of friends gather in the evening, hungry, and someone has always forgotten something. Maybe a knife, maybe a corkscrew. Not to worry, because a friend has one. Maybe a friend doesn't, but a stranger in the next group over does. A group of 3 becomes a group of 8, becomes a potluck of 20. And there are leftovers. Everyone has more than enough. There is so much happening in our immediate future, and we can only guess what any of it will be. Getting a sermon written on Thursday to deliver on Sunday is almost pointless. Elections don't solve the world's problems. Our saviors don't occupy government residences. As we find ourselves moved with compassion, or find ourselves stuck because of others' decisions, Jesus is moved by compassion too. Jesus tells us to pray, "Give us today our daily bread," and tells us, his disciples, now, you give them something to eat. God's reign is at hand. It's breaking in when one of you brings masks for us to give away, and another emails about giving away clothes that you've sorted during newfound downtime. God's reign is present. Jesus is having compassion and healing the sick when you give to the discretionary fund. And I help bail out demonstrators or pay rent or get a hotel room for a night. And God's reign is present when we give for months at a time to neighbors in need, collecting peanut butter so that people can have enough. Jesus manifests a freedom from self-concern that exposes our bondage to self-protection and the many forms of servitude to which self-regard holds us captive. Jesus' compassion unmasks our selfishness. It is not possible to follow Jesus and our own self-interests at the same time. So as we follow Jesus, as he has started working his way to the cross, we lay aside our self-interests, our heavy burdens of self-concern. Even in the midst of his grief, Jesus doesn't give up. He has compassion on the crowds and heals their sick. Jesus tells the disciples, "You give them something to eat. Then make sure that there's more than enough." Amen.